Greetings, everyone. My name is Sipiwe Baleka. I'm a member of the NCOBRA International Affairs Commission. It is my honor today to give this presentation, the role of the African Union in securing reparations for Africans on the continent and the diaspora. There's a lot of information in this presentation. I won't be reading everything, but everyone will have, we will get the presentation to everyone so you can have a copy of the full presentation with all the information. I'm going to go through this quickly, right? Maybe about 30 to 40 minutes so that the rest of the time we can have discussion and questions. So with that, I'm going to jump right in, right? NCOBRA's theme for 2025 is a year to heal. The African Union recently announced that its theme for the year 2025 is justice for Africans and people of African descent through reparations. On August 16th, the NCOBRA International Affairs Commission co-chairs invited the following African Union officials to discuss our common agendas: Dr. Ahmed Bougri, Ms. Salma Tanani, Ms. Angela Odai, Dr. Godfrey Odongo, Brian Kagoro, and Justice Alfred Mavedzengi. Many of these African Union officials are part of what is called CEDAW, which is the Citizens and Diaspora Directorate. It is the department responsible for leading the AU's engagement with non-state actors, and that would include us as the diaspora. We invited these officials to attend. We didn't get a response, and I don't think any of them are here, so we will proceed. And we do hope to have a dialogue with them in the future. Now, again, the African Union theme for the year 2025 is justice for Africans and people of African descent through reparations. Question 1, what kind of events are being planned? And question 2, what specific outcomes are envisioned? Okay. Now, in December of 2022, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights issued a resolution. And in that resolution, it calls upon member states to take measures to eliminate barriers to acquisition of citizenship and identity documentation by Africans in the diaspora, establish a committee to consult, seek the truth, and conceptualize reparations from Africa's perspective, describe the harm occasioned by the tragedies of the past, and establish a case for reparations, or what is called Africa's claim, and pursue the task of conceptualizing Africa's reparations agenda with urgency and determination. I took up that call to conceptualize reparations from Africa's perspective, starting with the original invasion of our peoples on the African continent, and therefore linking all African people on the continent and wherever they were dispersed into one single reparations claim. I presented that claim, Africa's claim, and at least the foundation principles to the Global Pan-African Roots Synergy Maputo Roundtable, which was commemorating and celebrating the 20th anniversary of the adoption of the Article 3Q amendment to the African Union Constitutive Act. And at that event, in the panel on the global case for reparatory justice, the legal structures, mechanism, instruments, and modalities, I had proposed that any global African reparatory justice strategy seeking reparations must, A, proceed from a historical understanding of the origin and development of uniquely African concepts and systems of law, B, recognize the conflict of laws that occurred between Africa and Europe when Pope Nicholas V issued the Dum Diversas Apostolic Edict, which is a declaration of total war that qualifies it as a crime against humanity with no statute of limitations. C, proceed from a narrative that in many areas of Africa, majority of them, slavery was not legal. Most certainly chattel slavery did not exist. And thus the Dum Diversas Apostolic Edict did not make slavery legal throughout the earth. And therefore the Ma'afa was not a transatlantic slave trade. It was a transatlantic trafficking of prisoners of war. We have to make the shift in the narrative from slave trade to trafficking of prisoners of war. And finally, D, it must insist that in accordance with principles of African law, as well as current international law, that the jurisdiction governing the adjudication must be the jurisdiction where the crime occurred, which in this case originated on the African continent. Now, after that December 22 call, and after the July Maputo summit, I then went to the ACRA Reparations Conference, right? And the African Union, sponsored by the Open Society Foundation, convened the International Conference on Building a United Front to advance the case of justice and reparations to African people. Out of that came the ACRA Proclamation on Reparations, which, one, establishes a committee of experts on reparations. Two, creates a global reparations fund. Three, establishes the Office of the African Union Special Envoy on Reparations. Four, recognizes African civil society efforts and seeks to have greater engagement with African civil society on reparations, and this is where NCOBRA comes in. Five, establishes a transcontinental partnership framework. Six, establishes a legal and judicial options for reparations. Seven, increases the role for the United Nations. Eight, establishes a legal reference group, which would provide legal advice to the AU Commission of Experts and AU Special Envoy, and provide thought leadership that would influence the policy and advocate for global norms supporting reparatory justice. Nine, it would amplify marginalized voices in the diaspora and reparations movement. 10, it seeks to reform the global financial systems. 11, it would provide an increased role for AU organs and regional economic communities, and that would include civil society. Again, that's us as NCOBRA. 12, links climate justice and reparatory justice. 13, repatriation, restitution, and safeguarding of cultural artifacts, provides a framework for that. 14, highlights neocolonialism and our persistent dependency on former colonial powers. And then 15, calls for regular international conference on reparations. Okay, you can read the details not only in this short summary, but you can get the full proclamation with the details. Here I am with Brian Kagoro, who is a senior official at the Open Society Foundation and works very closely with the African Union and played a key role in the ACRA Reparations Conference. Okay, now what I want to highlight is that the 2023 ACRA Proclamation on Reparations creates a transcontinental partnership framework between the African Union, CARICOM, Latin American states, and the African diaspora in Europe and all other regions in the world, including, where appropriate, relevant civil society organizations, to explore the legal and judicial options for reparations through the Citizens and Diaspora Directorate and the Economic, Social, and Cultural Council. This is where NCOBRA comes in. It establishes a committee of experts on reparations that will be in and this committee, in consultation with member states, ECOSOC, and other AU organs. And right now, we're not a member of ECOSOC, and we have no representation in it. It establishes the legal reference group and the African Union Transitional Justice Policy, which will seek to connect the advocacy groups in Africa and the global African diaspora for a common and united reparations agenda. So our next questions for the African Union are, what criteria is being used to determine the qualifications for an expert on reparations? Question 4, has the committee of experts been selected? Question 5, have the members of the legal reference group been chosen? Now, I have already put forward in an article who is an African expert on reparations, that the African Committee of Experts on Reparations cannot be comprised solely of technocrats. It must consist of people who have advanced the most in internal reparations, which is the self-repair and recovery from ethnocide. If someone, for example, cannot identify who are their maternal and or their paternal ancestors in Africa, and have no desire to identify with being African, and have not reorganized their life around Pan-Africanism and Ubuntu, can they really be said to have been repaired? The African Committee of Experts on Reparations should be composed of people who can properly guide the technocrats. Mere educational and professional credentials does not make one an expert on reparations. Proposed candidates should be asked, what is the evidence of your self-repair? And how have you used external resources for the benefit of Africa and her people's self-repair? Now, structuring the African Committee of Experts on Reparations. One way to bring structure to the proposed African Committee of Experts on Reparations is to follow NCOBRA's 5 injury areas of systemic oppression and systemic slavery, which are peoplehood, education, health, criminal punishment, and wealth and poverty. Now, I would change number 4, criminal punishment, to law. Each area could have 1 expert from the African continent and 1 from the African diaspora. That's a total of 12 experts. For example, who has come from the West and demonstrated wealth creation from an indigenous African enterprise? Who, for example, knows how to organize and amplify and distribute effective African medicine? The remaining 5 experts could be selected for recognized expertise in any field related to internal or external reparations, such as immigration, agriculture, diplomacy, administration, project management, etc. Now, following the ACRA Reparations Conference and the proclamation was the African Union Transitional Justice Policy, right, where the African Union and the African Transitional Justice Legacy Fund signed an MOU on reparatory justice and racial healing. The key objectives of the MOU include the implementation of this African Union Transitional Justice Policy, right, through these partnerships that will include civil society organizations in the diaspora, developing an African common position on reparations, again, utilizing this partnership with African diaspora civil society, right? Pursuing justice and repair for Africans and the diaspora, consensus and bridge building, education through convening publications, training and creative storytelling, etc., and promoting racial healing through dialogues, narrative building, all done through a partnership between Africa and its descendants in the global diaspora. Okay, so these are the pillars that are supporting next year's 2025 African Union theme revolving around reparations. Now, what can be NCOBRA's participation in this new AU reparations ecosystem? I'm putting forward that perhaps no other reparations organization has existed as long as NCOBRA, nor has as much reparations litigation experience as NCOBRA. And since there is no known official representative from the United States chosen by civil society as part of the 20 seats allocated for the African diaspora as the sixth region within the Economic, Social, and Cultural Council, right, through which all of the consultation is supposed to be occurring, right? It's through this organ, and we don't have any representatives there, at least not officially. Question number 6 to the African Union. Can the African Union authorize both NCOBRA and the African Union African Diaspora High Council North American Facilitator to submit its chosen expert for the Committee of Experts on Reparation and its representative for the Legal Reference Group, so that the 50 million people of African descent in the United States are included in the policy formation and decision-making process under the spirit of the Article 3Q amendment that, quote, invites and encourages the full participation of Africans in the diaspora in the building of the African Union in its capacity as an important part of our continent. So for those of you that don't know, we need to go into this Article 3Q amendment and this African Diaspora High Council. Okay, the Article 3Q amendment was proposed and adopted at the first extraordinary summit of the Assembly of the African Union 3 and 4 February 2003 in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And this is a picture of me back then. I attended that meeting. I was a recognized, accredited member of the press, of the media through a Rastafari Speaks newspaper. Here's my accreditation from the Ethiopian Government Ministry of Information. And this was why I was in the building and present when the African Union invited the diaspora to this full participation in building the African Union. Now, in my presentation, there is a brief overview, highlights of how the African Union Diaspora Initiative developed. And I also have a link to a really extensive documentation of all the documents, resolutions, and decisions leading from 2003 to today on the Diaspora Initiative. What's important, however, is this section, that in 2003, the African Union said that the diaspora should organize itself to become part of the Economic, Social, and Cultural Council and take 20 of the 150 seats. Now, by 2012, this instruction was ratified, right? And in paragraph 1, section K of the African Union African Diaspora Declaration and Program of Action that was issued on African Liberation Day 2012, it says, section K, encourage the diaspora to organize themselves in regional networks and establish appropriate mechanisms that will enable their increasing participation in the affairs of the African Union as observers and eventually in the future as a sixth region of the continent that would contribute substantially to the implementation of policies and programs. We are supposed to choose our own representatives and send them to the African Union's Economic, Social, and Cultural Council. That's what this says. And so myself and a group of others, starting in 2003, and then in real earnestness in 2006, 2007, started that organizing process, which included myself, Dr. David Horn of the Pan-African Organizing Committee out of, he's based out of California, and Dr. Beryl Beekman, who is based out of the Netherlands, had taken this instruction and said, okay, we are going to lead the process where we will decide who our representatives will be in each of the regions in the diaspora. And that has now evolved after 20 years of work, right, to the launching of the African Union Sixth Region High Council. That was done at that Maputo summit in July of 2023. 2023, Yeah. And, or 2024, yeah, 2023. And on September 16th, 2024, the AU 6th Region High Council facilitators have now appointed their first president to move the High Council into an functional operational new phase. Okay, and so it's supposed to have a member from the United States to be part of this High Council, which would develop these structures of the civil society engagement with the African Union. So that is why this question, right? I'm going to get to the question. But one more thing I need to bring up, which is this, so we have this High Council. The other thing is we have this unfinished business of Malcolm X and Amari Obadeli taking our claim to the International Court of Justice. I've already given this presentation to the NCOBRA through its Health and Education Committee. So I'm not going to go through all the details, but that presentation is also available. But what's important coming out of that presentation is understanding that in 1964, Malcolm X went to the Organization of African Unity, okay, to talk to the 33 or 34 African heads of state at that time. As the leader of our liberation and independence movement, whose united front was the Organization of Afro-American Unity, okay? He was given observer status, and he circulated a memorandum to the heads of state that said, if South Africa is guilty of violating the human rights of Africans here on the mother continent, then America is guilty of worse violations of the 22 million Africans on the American continent. And if South African racism is not a domestic issue, then American racism is also not a domestic issue. We beseech the independent African states to help us bring our problems before the United Nations on the grounds that the United States government is morally incapable of protecting the lives and the property of 22 million African Americans. Okay. Malcolm said our next move is to take the entire civil rights struggle problem into the United Nations and let the world see that Uncle Sam is guilty of violating the human rights of 22 million African Americans, right? It's the same thing that's going on now, right? The Palestinian case, the genocide against the Palestinians, brought to the International Court of Justice, right? Brought to the United Nations. Malcolm started doing that at the same time, 1964, bring our case. In an interview, when he was asked, did you receive any promises of assistance or help from any of the African nations? Malcolm said, oh yes, several of them promised officially that come the next session of the United Nations, any effort on our part to bring our problem before the UN will get support and help from the African nations. They will assist us in showing us how to bring it up legally, okay? Now, what's important to understand is that Malcolm X was killed on February 21st, 1965. 2 weeks later, the New York Times ran a story, headline, World Court Opens Africa Case Monday, which stated that the International Court of Justice will open oral proceedings Monday in a case linking the segregation struggle of the American Negroes and the fate of 430,000 African Bantus, right, in the 4-year effort by Ethiopia and Liberia to bring a case and bar South Africa from applying her apartheid doctrine in Southwest Africa, which is known as Namibia today. So, one case was brought before the International Court of Justice, that on the African continent side. Our case was also supposed to be brought before the International Court of Justice, but it was delayed. Why? Because they assassinated Malcolm X. And just before Malcolm's murder, Burundi Prime Minister was sorry, I lost my internet connection. So let me get back and we can resume. All right, so I was discussing Malcolm X and that the African heads of states were going to bring our court case, and they brought the court case against South Africa and apartheid, but they were supposed to bring the court case against the United States and its apartheid racism. That was stopped because they assassinated Malcolm. They assassinated the Burundi prime minister, who was a major supporter of the petition. They assassinated Muyinzi, a man who worked at the U.S. Embassy where the CIA was located. 4 days after Malcolm X's murder, Pio Gama Pinto, a Kenyan government official who was supporting the petition, he was also assassinated. All right, let me, I just want to make sure everything is recording. Let's see, hold on 1 second. Sorry about this. Okay, yes, it's recording. All right, just wanted to make sure. All right, so now we can continue. So, main point, African Union members, 1964, they were going to bring the case. Okay. Now let's continue. 4 years after this, the Malcolm X Society hosts the National Black Government Conference, in which the Liberation Forces declared the independence of the Republic of New Africa. Then, 5 years after that, a case is brought before the United States with the fundamental legal questions regarding our self-determination and reparations. The government's response to that case was that the question of our citizenship, our status under international law, is a matter of law and requires a decision based upon the issue of whether Black folks now within the United States have ever been converted in accordance with settled principles of universally established law into United States citizens and divested altogether of their original foreign African nationality. Even the United States government admits it can't answer the question on whether or not we are citizens of the United States under international law, and that question has to be settled by principles of universally established law, meaning it can't be settled by a domestic court because U.S. domestic court is established according to its own principles, not universal law, but its own national principles of law. So even the United States government says this question has to go to the International Court of Justice. Okay. Now, 2 years after the court case, Queen Mother Audley Moore, who happened to be the first signer of the Declaration of Independence of the Republic of New Africa, was invited by Ugandan President Idi Amin to be an honored guest representing New African people in their struggle for land and independence at the OAU summit in Kampala in Uganda in 1975. Now, here's what she said. I'm going to read this excerpt because it's very important. Here is what she said to the AU member states, but back then it's the Organization of African Unity, but the same states. She said, in those centuries of bondage, our African heritage was mocked. Our very blackness was made a laughingstock. We were brainwashed and crippled mentally as a people. But simultaneously, with the ascension to sovereignty of the formerly colonized states of Africa, we experienced a cultural revolution, the fight for identity, and this revolution has largely been won. We know now that we are a people, that we are an African people, and that we are an entity, a unique entity as Africans born in the United States of America. Our party emerged from the struggles of the past 15 years. We had to take the vague slogan of Black Power and give it concreteness. For power has to be exercised by a people, a nation. And before power can be exercised, the right of self-determination must be won. Citizenship in the United States was imposed on us in 1867 by the government unilaterally without even consulting us, without a plebiscite. We had no choice. The Congress of the United States declared us citizens. And by declaring us citizens, we were not only denied the right to self-determination, we were also denied the right to reparations for unpaid labor and the social degradation that slavery entails. While the act of conferring citizenship on Black captives seemed magnanimous on the one hand, on the other hand, Black codes were enacted by various states to nullify completely the benefits of citizenship. Our party emerged from the spontaneous rebellions that flared in every big city of the USA and made cities such as Watts, Newark, Detroit, Cleveland, and many others international symbols of our revolutionary national discontent. From murderous repressions officially approved, which killed or imprisoned a generation of our most gifted and dedicated revolutionary nationalist youth, from the so-called war on poverty aimed at placating the youthful revolutionaries while building a Black middle-class buffer. We Africans who are captives in the Western Hemisphere understand that our destiny and liberation are historically interlocked with the Africans everywhere. And we who are in colonial bondage in the United States government, or bondage by the United States government, ask that our African brothers and sisters in Africa take a stand in respect to our human rights. Africans born inside the United States ask our African brothers and sisters to hear our demands. We want self-determination and independent nationhood. We believe African captives in the USA will not have freedom until they have land of their own and a government, a nation that we govern, run, and control. We demand the states of Mississippi, Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, and Louisiana as partial repayment for injustice done to us for over 400 years. We want an independent, self-governing economy to guarantee full employment for our people. And we believe the U.S. federal government owes us for 400 years of slavery and 100 years of forced citizenship servitude. We demand the U.S. government pay the colonized captive African $400 billion for 10 years as partial repayment for its crimes of genocide against our people. Now, I'm bringing this up. We wanted to do this in front of the African Union officials to remind them of our shared history, that our reparations movement and the heads of state of Africa organized in the Organization of African Unity, now the African Union, we have a history, and that the African Union's obligation is to bring our case before the International Court of Justice. We want to remind them, this should be part of one of the major themes of next year, so that we can actually bring it before the International Court of Justice. So we have to remind them of the history and then perform the unfinished business. Now, why is it unfinished? Why didn't it happen? We got to understand that 3 years after Queen Mother Audley Moore's intervention at the OAU, the United States government issued National Security Council Memorandum 46 that authorized clandestine operations to destroy the new African independence movement and prevent it from working with the OAU, its members, and other liberation movements on the continent. This official United States policy didn't just come out of nowhere. It was a response to the fact that Malcolm was now, he had started the coordination with the African liberation movements on the continent, went to the OAU African Liberation Support Committee, got instructions, set up the United Front, and was training the underground forces. Queen Mother Audley Moore went back to the OAU to remind them, we're still here, we're still struggling. And the United States government, 3 years after this intervention at the OAU, issued this memorandum in order to inhibit any pressure by radical African leaders and organizations on the U.S. Black community and tried to prevent any influence, right? The Black Africa and the U.S. Black movement, right? The nationalist liberation movement in Black Africa can act as a catalyst with far-reaching effects on the American Black community. It would appear essential to elaborate and carry out effective countermeasures. Possibility of joint action by U.S. Black and African nationalist movement. There are 25 million American Blacks whose roots are African and who consciously or subconsciously sympathize with African nationalism. These factors taken together may provide a basis for joint actions of a concrete nature by the African nationalist movement and the U.S. Black community. There would also be attempts to coordinate their political activity both locally and in international organizations, which would cause the reemergence of Pan-African ideals and a renewal of the extremist idea, the national idea of establishing an African republic on American soil. This could initiate discussions on the U.S. racial issue at the United Nations. And Black Americans interested in African affairs may refocus their attention on the Arab-Israeli conflict. Therefore, political options include, right, inhibiting the coordinated activity of the Black movement in the United States. Special clandestine operations should be launched by the CIA to generate mistrust and hostility in America and world opinion against the joint activity of the two forces, the forces on the African continent and the forces in America, and to cause division among Black African radical national groups and their leaders. The FBI should mount surveillance operations against Black African representatives, making possible at least the partial neutralization of adverse effects of their joint activity. Range of policy options, right? So the United States government is going to enlarge programs for the improvement of social and economic welfare of American Blacks, right? Bring into effect a special program designed to perpetuate divisions in the Black movement and neutralize the most active groups of leftist radical organizations and encourage division in Black circles. Inhibit the emergence from within the Black leadership of a person capable of exerting nationwide appeal. Impede durable ties between U.S. Black organizations and radical new groups in the African states. Support actions designed to sharpen social stratification in the Black community, which would lead to the widening and perpetuation of the gap between successful educated Blacks and the poor, giving rise to growing antagonism between the different Black groups and weakening of the movement as a whole. Facilitate the greatest possible expansion of Black business by granting government contracts and loans with favorable terms to Black businessmen. Support the nomination at federal and local levels of loyal Black public figures to elective office, to government agencies and the court. This would promote the achievement of a twofold purpose. First, it would be easier to control the activity of loyal Black representatives within existing institutions. And second, the idea of an independent Black political party now under discussion within Black leadership circles would soon lose all support. Okay, so we have to understand that after all of this work at the OAU, to bring the nationalist forces on the continent and at home into a oneness, the United States government extended its COINTELPRO, not just domestically, but internationally, to inhibit, right, us working together, okay? The African Union needs to be reminded of this. And we also need to be reminded that when we vote in elections that support these, whether Democrats and Republicans, this is exactly what they want us to do. All right. So the matter of our conversion as citizens is one of the substantive issues to be taken up at the ICJ. I've already printed out information. We have already submitted a request for an advisory opinion, right? With specific exact questions that lays the groundwork for our reparations claim to be legally brought before the world, just like the Palestinians. I'm not going to go into details about that, but I do want to emphasize that both the question and the answers hinge upon our status as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention and our status as an internal or domestic colony of the United States. Both require a historic and legal review, okay? Now, bringing up this history, right, of the relationship, one of the things we want to do in 2025 is renew the observer status that was originally given to us, to Malcolm and the OAAU, and then to Queen Mother Audley Moore. And so to pursue that, the Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa, through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, has sought to reestablish this relationship and has done 3 interventions, 2 in February and 1 in July. We have delivered letters, all right, at the African Union in Addis Ababa, and we are waiting for a response so that we can reestablish our renewal, our observer status, not as an NGO, but as a liberation movement and as a provisional government. That's an entirely different process, okay? What I want to emphasize, right, again, right, the 2023 ACRA Reparations Proclamation calls for an increased role from the United Nations, okay? So as a result, right, I was a member of this commission, but in a different capacity, I had submitted a request for an ICJ advisory opinion on the status of Afro-descendant peoples as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention and their right to conduct plebiscites for self-determination. The Permanent Forum of People of African Descent said they will make this an issue at the 3rd session. They didn't, and so now they need to discuss it at the 4th session. But all of this is in alignment with the African Union's ACRA proclamation that says we need to do a legal reference group to bring these legal strategies. We need to involve with the United Nations, and we need to include the diaspora civil society organizations. This is what this is. This is what NCOBRA is doing and others. So I'm not going to go into, I do want to talk about the example of the recent ICJ advisory opinion on the legal consequences arising from Israel's policies and practices in the occupied Palestinian territory. I'm not going to read all of this, but the bottom line is, in December of 2022, a request for an advisory opinion was made. That led to, within 1 year, the South African government actually filing a case against Israel at the International Court of Justice that received worldwide attention. Okay, we all watched the ICJ proceeding as if it was the World Cup. And as a result of that, just last week or the week before, the United Nations has adopted the ICJ's advisory opinion that says the occupation is illegal and that Israel has to pay reparations, recognize the Palestinians' right to return, a whole slew of things. And so now the 195 members of the United Nations have now decided on concrete actions to force Israel, right, to pay reparations under its international obligations. So if a request for an ICJ opinion, just 2 simple questions in exact detail, could within 2 years lead to the whole international community now taking concrete actions to force Israel to comply with its reparations obligations. If that can be done for the Palestinians, why can't it be done for us? This should be a major focal point of the 2025 theme, the year of African reparatory justice. Okay, so this leads us to question number 7. Will the African Union do for the new African and Afro descendants in the United States what members of the OAU promised and what the African Union and the South African government is doing for the Palestinian people regarding the exercise of their self-determination, and assist them in initiating advisory proceedings before the International Court of Justice by submitting their request, since we lack standing before the court to initiate proceedings ourselves. And question 8, how can NCOBRA and the Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa get assistance from the legal reference group on this and make it an agenda item for the African Union in 2025 in alignment with the theme, Justice for Africans and People of African Descent through Reparations, and in conjunction with the proposed 2025 National Reparations Rally in Washington, D.C., scheduled for Saturday, May 17th. Question 9, what kind of support can the African Union give to those new Africans and Afro-descendants in the United States territory of the AU 6th region who wish to exercise their right to self-determination, keeping in mind that it was these very new Africans and Afro-descendants who assisted the liberation movements on the African continent that resulted in the independence of several AU members? Question 10, how do we get an African Union resolution or decision recognizing new African and Afro-descendants' right to self-determination? Question 11, how can the African Union support the effort to conduct a plebiscite that would allow the approximately 29 million Black people of voting age in the United States the opportunity to choose their individual economic, social, cultural, and political destiny and receive reparations to pursue it by voting for one of the following 4 options? 1, return to Africa under their birthright right to return. 2, the creation of a new African nation on American soil. 3, emigration to another country. Or 4, full and equal U.S. citizenship. And question number 12, what can the African Union do to bring diplomatic pressure on the United States to pass House Resolution H.R. 40? Okay, so in wrapping up, why our legal questions are so important. Okay, if substantiated by the highest court on planet Earth, the International Court of Justice, 1, the legal foundation for states, particularly African states, to initiate reparations claims under law with binding force is made. 2, the global African reparations movement would have a unifying legal framework to tie together all claims for the illegal trafficking and enslavement of people from the African continent, regardless of their lineage or location. This could trigger a massive mobilization and organization. 3, the obstacle of statute of limitations is overcome. And 4, if substantiated, we have exhausted all peaceful means for obtaining justice and can now adjust strategy and tactics appropriately. So, this is, in my opinion, some of the major issues of importance that we need to sit down with the African Union to see how do we work together, because it's all in alignment with our theme for 2025 and NCOBRA's Year of Healing and the African Union's theme for 2025. And so that was the reason for calling this NCOBRA, to try to get the African Union officials to discuss with us what they expect, what they're planning, and what they expect the outcomes to be. And so hopefully we will continue to pursue the African Union officials on this to see how we can become partners. And now I think we have a good hour and 15 minutes to discuss the issues and the questions and have a great discussion. So thank you for paying attention. And now let's get to the discussion.